The house smelled of bleach. The curtains were drawn. And on the bedroom floor lay the body of a woman whose husband once said, "Better dead than shamed." In a quiet Florida neighborhood where no one locked their doors, police would uncover a story of pride, disease, and denial that still leaves investigators haunted to this day. But what exactly happened behind those closed doors? How did a once loving husband become capable of the unthinkable? Welcome to Silent Witness, True Crime Stories. Thanks to all my viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay tuned for daily true crime updates. Don't forget to subscribe and also download your free ebook by clicking the link in the pinned comment. This isn't just a story about a crime. It's about shame, silence, and what happens when appearances matter more than truth. Who was Clarissa, the woman whose body was literally breaking down from within? Why did Thomas, her husband of 12 years, believe that death was preferable to disgrace? And what secret did Clarissa hide for months, terrified that the man she loved might find out? These are the questions that haunted investigators as they stood in that bedroom, trying to piece together how love could turn into something so dark. How could a man who once promised to protect his wife end up being the one who destroyed her? The answers lie in the months leading up to that night, in the small moments that nobody noticed, in the silence that grew louder with each passing day. Thomas and Clarissa Johnson seemed like the kind of couple anyone would envy. Their home, a small but tidy house in northern Florida, always had fresh flowers out front and a flag fluttering from the porch. Thomas, a retired Army sergeant, carried himself with the discipline of a man who believed in order and control. Every morning at 6, he'd be out mowing the lawn or washing his truck, dressed in pressed khakis and a polo shirt, even though he had nowhere to be. Neighbors would wave and he'd nod back, polite but reserved. Clarissa, gentle and graceful, worked part-time at a youth center. Everyone called her the heart of the neighborhood. She cooked for sick neighbors, volunteered at church, and was known for her kindness. Mrs. Patterson from 3 doors down still talks about the casserole Clarissa brought over when her husband passed. It was the little things, people said. The way she remembered birthdays, the way she'd stop to chat even when she was clearly in a hurry. They'd been married for 12 years, no children, just the two of them in that little house with the white picket fence. Friends from church said they seemed content, quiet, the kind of couple who didn't need much beyond each other. But behind that perfect picture, something was changing. Clarissa began to grow quieter, tired, pale. She started missing Wednesday prayer meetings, something she'd never done before. When friends asked if she was okay, she'd smile that same gentle smile and say she was just a little under the weather. At first, it was just a smell she couldn't explain, but soon it became something she couldn't escape. It started as a dull ache. Clarissa thought it was stress, or maybe a simple infection. She was 43, and her body had been through changes before. Nothing a little rest wouldn't fix, she told herself. But within weeks, the pain grew unbearable. Her body began to emit a smell she couldn't wash away, no matter how many showers she took. She'd stand under scalding water for 30 minutes at a time, scrubbing until her skin turned red, but the odor remained. It was faint at first, sweet and sour at the same time, like fruit left too long in the sun. She bought new soaps, different perfumes, scented candles for every room. She washed the sheets twice a day. Thomas noticed. Of course he noticed. But in their house, they didn't talk about embarrassment. They didn't talk about weakness. Thomas had been raised by a father who believed men didn't cry and women didn't complain, and he'd carried those beliefs into his marriage like a family heirloom. When Clarissa started wearing long sleeves even in the Florida heat, he didn't ask why. When she began sleeping on her side of the bed with a pillow barrier between them, he simply moved to face the wall. Every night she prayed the smell would fade. Every morning, it returned stronger. She could see it in his eyes now, the way he'd look at her across the dinner table, his jaw tight, his fork moving mechanically from plate to mouth. No words, just that look. Disappointment, disgust, maybe both. Then one night, he confronted her. They were getting ready for bed, and she was lighting candles again, 3 of them on the dresser, vanilla and lavender. "What are you hiding from me?" His voice was calm, which somehow made it worse. She froze, her hand still on the matchbox. "I'm not hiding anything, Thomas. Don't lie to me, Clarissa. I can smell it. Whatever's wrong with you, I can smell it." She turned to face him, and for a moment she considered telling him everything. About the pain, about the discharge, about the fear that kept her awake at night. But then she saw the way he was looking at her, like she was something broken that needed to be fixed or thrown away, and the words died in her throat. "It's nothing," she whispered. "Just a little infection. It'll pass." He stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head and walked out of the room. That was the beginning of the end. Because the next morning, Clarissa's secret would no longer be just hers to carry. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. When Clarissa stopped showing up at the community center, her co-workers grew worried. She'd always been reliable, the kind of person who'd show up even when she was sick because the kids depended on her. But 3 weeks passed with no word, no returned calls, no explanation. Her supervisor, a woman named Rachel, finally called the police for a wellness check. She told the dispatcher she had a bad feeling, that something wasn't right. The officers who responded to the Johnson home on that Tuesday afternoon would later describe what they found as one of the most disturbing scenes of their careers, and not because of violence or blood, but because of the silence. The house was immaculate. Not a dish in the sink, not a speck of dust on the furniture, but the smell was overwhelming. It hit them the moment Thomas opened the door, a thick, cloying sweetness that made them instinctively step back. Thomas stood there in his pressed khakis and polo shirt, his face blank, his hands at his sides. "She's in the bedroom," he said quietly. Inside, officers found Clarissa's body in the bedroom, partially covered with a white sheet, candles still burning around her. 6 of them, placed in a perfect circle on the floor. She'd been dead for at least 3 days, maybe longer. The medical examiner would later confirm that the smell wasn't just decomposition. It was the smell of infection, of tissue that had been dying long before her heart stopped beating. Thomas sat quietly in a chair in the living room while the officers secured the scene. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He simply sat there, his hands folded in his lap, staring at a photograph on the wall. It was their wedding photo. The 2 of them standing outside a small church, both smiling, both young, both believing they had forever. When Detective Martinez arrived and asked what happened, Thomas looked up at him with eyes that seemed empty of everything except exhaustion. "Better dead than shamed," he said. Just that, nothing more. But what did he mean by that? What kind of shame could drive a man to murder the woman he once vowed to protect? The detective pressed him for details, but Thomas just shook his head. "You wouldn't understand. Nobody would understand." The neighbors, when interviewed, were in shock. The Petersons, who lived next door, said they'd heard nothing unusual. No arguments, no screams, nothing. Mrs. Chen from across the street said she'd seen Clarissa a few weeks back, looking thin and tired, but she'd assumed it was just the flu going around. Everyone described the same thing. A perfect couple, quiet and respectable, the kind of neighbors you'd want. Nobody had any idea what was happening behind those closed doors. The autopsy results would reveal a truth more disturbing than anyone expected. Medical reports showed that Clarissa had been suffering from a rare, untreated infection that had caused tissue decay. The official term was necrotizing fasciitis, a flesh-eating bacterial infection that had started in her reproductive system and spread rapidly. It was a condition that could have been treated if she had gone to the doctor. Antibiotics, possibly surgery, but caught early, she would have survived. But she didn't go. She didn't seek help. And the question that haunted everyone involved in the case was simple and heartbreaking. Why? The answer came in pieces, from Thomas himself during his interrogation, From Clarissa's journal that police found hidden in a shoebox in the closet, and from friends who'd noticed the small changes but hadn't understood what they meant. In Thomas's world, appearances were everything. Weakness was shame. Illness was failure. He'd grown up in a household where his mother never complained about anything, where problems were dealt with privately or not at all. When he joined the army, that mindset only strengthened. You pushed through pain. You didn't admit vulnerability. You certainly didn't air your dirty laundry. And somehow, over 12 years of marriage, that belief system had infected their relationship like a disease of its own. So Clarissa hid her pain until it consumed her. She wrote in her journal about the fear that paralyzed her every time she thought about seeing a doctor. Not fear of the diagnosis, but fear of Thomas finding out. Fear of seeing that look in his eyes, the one that said she'd disappointed him. In one entry dated 6 weeks before her death, she wrote something that made Detective Martinez pause when he read it. "I know I'm getting worse. I know I should get help, but I can't bear the thought of him knowing what's wrong with me. He'd never look at me the same way again. He'd never touch me again, and I'd rather die than see disgust in his eyes every day for the rest of my life." She chose silence over survival, and when Thomas finally discovered the extent of her condition, his response wasn't compassion. It was rage. Not loud, violent rage, but the cold, calculated kind. Because to him, her illness wasn't a medical emergency. It was a humiliation, a stain on the image they'd built together. How could she let herself get this bad? How could she hide it from him? How could she put him in this position? These were the questions he asked her, according to his own confession, in the days before she died. And when she became too weak to even get out of bed, when the infection had ravaged her body to the point where death was inevitable, he made a decision. He would not call for help. He would not let doctors see her like this. He would not let the neighbors whisper about what happened to poor Clarissa Johnson. He would let nature take its course, and then he would make it look like she'd passed peacefully. But even as police pieced the case together, one final twist was still waiting. Thomas confessed without hesitation. He waived his right to an attorney and told Detective Martinez everything in a calm, measured voice. He said he couldn't bear to see his wife suffer or to have the community whisper about her condition. He claimed he'd been protecting her, giving her dignity in death that she couldn't have in life. He described how he'd stayed by her bedside those final days, how he'd held her hand even though the smell made him nauseous, how he'd whispered promises that everything would be okay. He said he loved her. He said he'd always loved her, and maybe that was true, in his own warped way. But love doesn't let someone die to avoid embarrassment. Love doesn't value reputation over life. The prosecution called it depraved indifference, a willful disregard for human life. Thomas had known Clarissa was dying. He'd watched it happen. And he'd made the conscious choice to do nothing, not because medical help wasn't available, but because seeking it would have shattered the image he'd worked so hard to maintain. The court saw it as murder. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The defense tried to argue that Thomas had been in shock, that he hadn't fully understood how serious Clarissa's condition was, that he'd thought she was getting better. But Clarissa's journal entries, read aloud in court, painted a different picture. They showed a woman who'd begged him to take her to the hospital in her final days, who'd been too weak to go herself, who'd sobbed and pleaded while he sat in his chair and told her they'd figure it out at home. The jury deliberated for just over 6 hours, guilty of second-degree murder. In his mind, he had protected her from shame, but in truth, he had destroyed the very image he was trying to preserve. Because now, instead of being remembered as the kind woman who brought casseroles and volunteered at the youth center, Clarissa Johnson would forever be known as the woman whose husband let her die rather than admit she was sick. The community that had once admired them was now horrified. The neighbors who'd waved to Thomas every morning couldn't look at him. The church where they'd worshipped together held a memorial service that Thomas wasn't allowed to attend. Pride can build beautiful walls, but it also traps the people we love inside them. Clarissa's silence and Thomas's pride were two sides of the same coin, and together they created tragedy. But there's one more detail few people know, something Thomas whispered to police that night after they'd taken his statement and were preparing to transport him to county jail. When asked why he didn't call for help, why he let her suffer when one phone call could have saved her life, he simply said, "Because shame doesn't heal." He believed it. Even after everything, sitting in that interrogation room with his wife's blood on his conscience, he believed that protecting their reputation was more important than saving her life. And that, more than anything else, is what made this case so chilling.